Welcome to the Kitsap Literary Artists and Writers of Washington and its monthly author showcase. I'm your host, Mark Miller. Author Thomas Mengert is visiting with us this month at the Bremerton Kitsap Access Television Studios. Tom is a double-threat artist, being a playwright as well as an author of 10 books, including a 7-volume series, The Confessions of Sherlock Holmes. Welcome to Claw and the BCAT audience.
Thanks, Mark.
Now, to start out with, can you give us some history on how you became a Sherlockian author?
Well, my interest in Sherlock Holmes goes all the way back to when I was still in the 8th grade. I watched some of the Basil Rathbone movies, including The Scarlet Claw and The House of Fear, and they had such splendid titles that I thought it would be very interesting to see what was going on. And then I was fortunate in finding the Doubleday edition of the Complete Sherlock Holmes, which has every single novel and short story of Sherlock Holmes in it. And so from there, it just became a passion with me. And by the time I got to college, I decided that I'd read almost everything, and I was saving 1 or 2 last short stories because I said, once I read these, that's the end, and there won't be any more Sherlock Holmes. And then I thought, well, there must be a lot of people who feel the same way. So I published a newspaper that was called the Victorian Gentleman's, and it was called the Victorian Journal. And 2 universities subscribed to it, and various Sherlock Holmes aficionados around the country, and did it all from a local print shop, and had a neat cover with the pens in the corners that I'd set up. So already I had this passion for covers, which you can see now on the books that I finally wrote. And from there, I was listed later on in Ron Dewall's The World Bibliography of Sherlock Holmes, which gathered all the Sherlock Holmes information together. And John Bennett Shaw, who was the largest private collector of Sherlock Holmes memorabilia, was one of my subscribers and correspondents. And I'd always intended to write a Sherlock Holmes story that would capture the flavor of the original tales, because so many of the Sherlock Holmes, I will call them Sherlock Holmes wannabes, what they tend to do is they'll throw in a few My Dear Watsons hither and yon, but they don't capture the spirit of the original tales, and they don't have the Victorian sound to the sentences. And so, except for knowing that it's about Sherlock Holmes, you don't feel that Dr. Watson is talking to you. And later on in the broadcast, I'll explain why there's such an appeal for Sherlock Holmes with this. But that was my beginning. That's how it all got started.
Well, since you mentioned Basil Rathbone, I grew up with those movies too. When you started writing, is that kind of your vision of what you visualize Sherlock Holmes as?
Actually, I'm what you might call a Sherlock Holmes purist, and by that I mean that I really was determined in my own writing to make sure that I was writing in the original spirit of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And I was so careful about that in writing my 7 volumes, I was very careful to make sure that I didn't conflict with the order of the tales as listed in the annotated Sherlock Holmes, and that everything that I said could be explained as having its jumping off point from the original stories. So I was writing with an audience in mind that could be either new people who would like to be reacquainted with Sherlock Holmes by seeing how I've put the whole saga together, but I also wanted to say if there was anybody who was a real Sherlock Holmes expert, that they would have no problem with what I had said, because it would all sandwich in correctly with the existing saga.
So you wrote the 7 volumes on a subject and a character that has been covered by numerous authors and scholars, and in fact there have been courses colleges taught on this. So I take it what you just mentioned is what makes you different from all these other authors and scholars?
Well, here's how it has happened. The early people, before there was this deluge of new tales, because at that time, of course, Sherlock Holmes was not in the public domain, and therefore new writers were somewhat restricted in creating new Sherlock Holmes stories. One of the best Sherlock Holmes knockoffs was August Derleth's Adventures of Solar Ponds. And these were wonderful tales, and they did sound rather like the originals, and they brought a lot of people pleasure. And but the real experts on Sherlock Holmes did a very interesting thing. They formed these Sherlock Holmes societies all over the country. And to this day, these Sherlock Holmes clubs are found in almost every city of any great size. And what makes them interesting is that they took for their guiding assumption that Sherlock Holmes was real. And so what they did is they would go to any length to investigate some tiny, minute question, and they would try to find, for instance, if he went to visit a country manor, they would try to locate that country manor and would write these long articles explaining why this had to be the case. And so they, in fact, got to act as though they themselves were detectives. And this whole methodology was done by the Sherlock Holmes Society of London, and is done by the Baker Street Irregulars of New York, under Dr. Julian Wolfe. And that was the beginning of the great publishing boom. But it was done in the form of a scholarly journal, and to this day you can get back copies of the Baker Street Journal, which was their publication.
So this kind of kept this mega popularity of the Conan Doyle creation going.
Mm-hmm. Now, the next stage happened when finally the Sherlock Holmes stories entered the public domain. And when that happened, all of a sudden you started seeing Sherlock Holmes stories popping up in different places. And sometimes it was Sherlock Holmes met Dracula, sometimes yes. It was met...
classic.
There were all these different Sherlock Holmes meets this. There was never a Sherlock Holmes goes to Africa and meets Tarzan, but it wasn't too far away, So I didn't want to go that way. And I took a very unique tack. Sherlock Holmes is interesting. He was so popular with other people, but not necessarily popular with his own author. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle thought of himself as a historical novelist and wanted to write great historical novels like Sir Walter Scott had done. So what happened is, as Holmes grew in popularity and as money became less of an object for Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, what happened was he finally reached a point where he said, you know what, he takes my mind from better things, was his phrase. And so he killed Sherlock Holmes off. And he did this in a story called The Final Problem. He explains that in all of his career there was one most brilliant of all criminals, and this was Professor James Moriarty. And so what happens is that he acts in such a way as to bring about the destruction of Professor Moriarty's organization. Think of an early Godfather, and there you have Professor Moriarty. And he calls him the Napoleon of crime. So basically, if there's anything that's unsolved crime, the odds are Professor Moriarty's thought about it and has been instrumental in accomplishing it. So what happens is he winds up collecting all of the Moriarty organization and somehow throwing them all into jail, and Moriarty is stripped of his livelihood, and so Moriarty, out of revenge, tracks Holmes and Watson to Switzerland. They go to the top of the Reichenbach Falls. Watson goes down on a false errand to do some medical care for an English woman who's ailing back at the inn. Holmes meets Professor Moriarty on the brink of the waterfall. They wrestle. Holmes does a karate move that he calls it Baritsu, And basically Moriarty goes over, Holmes is okay, and then he disappears for 4 years. And then in the book of short stories called The Return of Sherlock Holmes, he's resurrected miraculously, and it turns out that only Moriarty went over the falls, but he himself is alive. And Watson is startled to learn that Holmes is alive. And the reason that Conan Doyle did this is there was such a clamoring. People actually wore black armbands, and one old lady came up to Sir Arthur in the street and said, "You brute, how could you kill him?" You know. So this is some of the scuttlebutt of real life. And so what happened is the bringing him back left some major questions, which I'll come to in a minute and explain to you why it is that I wrote my book.
Okay.
But what's intriguing with regard to this is that Holmes was brought back by degrees. The most famous of all the novels is The Hound of the Baskervilles. And The Hound of the Baskervilles takes place in 1888, and the supposed death at Reichenbach Falls takes place in 1891. So technically he had not yet resurrected Holmes. But Hound of the Baskervilles was the most famous and most widely selling a novel on the detective genre that had ever been. So what happened is the money and everything else, and just the interest of the public and the clamoring was so great that he had to bring him back. And he brought him back for several more books. He brought him back for The Valley of Fear. He brought him back for a group of stories called His Last Bow. Brought him back for finally the case book of Sherlock Holmes. And so after that, that was the end of Sherlock Holmes. And it's intriguing, I didn't discover this till the end, but my entire 7 volumes of the Confessions of Sherlock Holmes is longer than anything that Conan Doyle ever wrote on Sherlock Holmes in his life. That wasn't necessarily my intent at the beginning, but I was determined to write an organic book that would end when it ended. And I wrote the book precisely that way. And it did, in fact, take 7 volumes to do so.
So then in the whole genre of mystery, where does Sherlock Holmes fit in?
Well,
some people say that that was the first true detective series. Do you agree with that?
No. He took his inspiration from several sources. First of all, he practically copied Auguste Dupin, who was a creation of Edgar Allan Poe. And there was also a French writer, and since I don't speak French, I will probably mangle the name, but it began with a G. It was like Gaborio or something. And there was also a professor named Bell, who was very good at doing diagnostic evaluations for people and could look at a patient that was coming in and not only say what they were ailing from, but could also explain their walk of life and everything about them. So this was one of the things that kind of put Holmes over at the beginning, was this idea that how does he know all this? How can he just take a look? It's like magic. And then what Conan Doyle would do is he would have Watson, who never seemed to understand anything, and explain how, if they properly understood it, if they'd observed, they would have seen precisely what Holmes did, but that they didn't draw the right conclusions. But he'd lead you through it. And so half the fun of reading a Sherlock Holmes story was you'd try to figure out what it was, and then when you finally saw the conclusion, you'd say, gosh, why didn't I see that? And he was so good at that, particularly in the short stories. The other thing that made Sherlock Holmes popular is he's a very unusual character. He keeps his tobacco in the toe of a Persian slipper. He goes through long depressive episodes where he won't leave Baker Street. He has some nameless ailment, which I go into great detail of explaining precisely what that ailment was, and that he suffered from through his life. And he was... Yet he was apparently a great swordsman, single-stick player, boxer, very strong, very lean and wiry, very scientific. Always had all kinds of scientific regalia around his rooms, flasks and test tubes and things. And then he had a penchant for disguises. So every little personal detail that was added added to his charm and individuality, so much so that to this day, various artifacts immediately call up the image of Sherlock Holmes, from the deerstalker hat, of which I brought my own, to the bent pipe or the calabash, whereas Holmes in the real stories actually smoked a clay pipe like a church warden. So basically it has a long stem and you smoke it down here, but some of the early dramatic presentations of Sherlock Holmes, this was kind of nice to have the bent briar, because you can see the actor's face, and the church warden perhaps looked a little too 18th century, you know.
You've already mentioned Professor Moriarty, so of course when that name comes up to the average follower of Sherlock Holmes, they immediately get some type of image. What kind of image do you get?
Well, fortunately the great illustrators, Sidney Paget and Edward Adair Steele, I think I've got the first name right, they had such beautiful illustrations in the Strand magazine of Sherlock Holmes that we knew what Professor Moriarty looked like, and he was stoop-shouldered and elderly, precisely the very type of man who does not wrestle a younger man who's an expert boxer on the brink of a waterfall. Okay. Particularly if he has his second-in-command, Colonel Sebastian Moran, armed with an air gun at the top of the falls, ready to shoot Holmes as he tries to make his escape. So that told me immediately that there was no way that Professor Moriarty died at the Reichenbach Falls. So naturally I said, well then, somebody needs to explain what really happened. And so I said, it's very clear what really happened, is that both Holmes and Moriarty were ready for a career change. Moriarty was a great scientist, had already published a mathematical treatise on the binomial theorem, and wanted to raise racehorses. Because of his Irish ancestry, he was fascinated by the life of a country gentleman. Holmes has spent all his time in London solving problems for governesses and things, and wanted to, stretch out a little. And his brother Mycroft had suggested that perhaps he might tour some areas that were giving the British government some trouble. And so he would go to the Sudan and to Persia and to various places. But that's all that's said in the original stories. So I simply took the hints and connected all the dots together and explained that Holmes was on a mission for Mycroft. He and Professor Moriarty reached an agreement at the Reichenbach Falls. And the nature of the agreement is, and that's why the very first volume is called The Wager at Reichenbach Falls. What happens is Moriarty comes up to Holmes and says, I want to take on your brother. You're smart, but he's smarter. And I want to take on the whole British government, and I'm going to think up a plot that will destroy the entire British Empire. And I know that you want to travel, and I know you want to pursue the deeper meaning of life. You've always been more of a philosopher than anything else. So why don't you do that? And we'll reach a deal here. And I trust you so much that I will make sure that you're safe during your travels. I'll send my second-in-command to be your bodyguard, Colonel Sebastian Moran. And while you're traveling around talking to gurus and figuring out what the nature of existence is, I'm going to be thinking up a plan that will wipe out the British Empire. But if you can come back home and explain to me that there's any purpose for this crazy world in which we live, and that crime basically not only doesn't pay but is wrong, then I will help you destroy my own plot at the moment of its execution. If you lose, of course, then I get to destroy the British Empire, and you can go off with your idealistic notions anywhere you want. So the first 4 volumes explain Holmes. Where does he go? Why does he do it? And he keeps a journal while he does so, exploring every possible avenue of philosophy, economic theory, politics. Everything that I ever wanted to write about is in there and is explained as Holmes encounters them. And it all leads up to volumes 5, 6, and 7, which is where Holmes and Moriarty meet and thrash it out between them. So the essence of a mystery story is actually to write about solving problems. And I thought, well, I've been handed this thing. I've got the greatest detective that ever was, and I've got the most evil villain that ever was. Wouldn't it be neat if they didn't just fight about, some bank robbery or some stagecoach holdup, but what if they actually had to fight about the nature of existence itself? Why are we here? What's it all about? I said, why not write that type of mystery story? And so that's what I did, and that's why it came to 7 volumes.
So a lot of your book will be written in like a tone of Sherlock Holmes, but not necessarily like him running around doing the elementary, my dear Watson, and going on this big long conversation as to why so-and-so was killed and all that stuff.
Now this is very interesting because I also had to devise a method. When you're a writer, the one thing that you contribute really is less the substance of what you write than the style. All the people that have written what we think of as works of literature, they helped the novel form take its next step. Well, an example of that is Marcel Proust with his huge 7 volumes, The Remembrance of Things Past, James Joyce with Ulysses, and later on with Finnegan's Wake that I did my master's thesis on. What I wanted to do is I said, I have to make this work in 2 ways. I have to be able to explain my philosophy, but at the same time I have to keep a plot line going to keep the momentum of the story moving forward. So what I did is I invented what I call an intertwined method, and I visualize it like this. What happens is that as you read the story, you're bouncing back and forth between 2 separate narratives. One is Sherlock Holmes' diaries and journals, which run from 1891 to 1897, which is where Volume 1 begins. And the other is the adventure that Watson, the traditional narrator of the Sherlock Holmes stories, is telling the reader. And that runs from 1897 to 1899. And that's, quote, real time, right now. That's what's happening. Mm-hmm. And while Watson and Holmes are having this adventure, which takes them in Volume 6 as far as the shores of America, and takes them to Europe and takes them to all these fascinating places where they meet all these fascinating historical figures. At the same time, Watson is saying, I'm reading, in the evening when I've come home from my adventures, I'm reading Sherlock Holmes's diary so that I now know what actually happened between 1891 and 1894. So by doing it this way, I was able to put 2 entirely different books together and tell the stories simultaneously and have them reflecting back and forth on each other.
And then at the end of your 7 volumes, you dovetail into the follow-up that Conan Doyle did after he brought Holmes back.
Well, what I do at that point is I bring Holmes back to London. Now, supposedly Sherlock Holmes retired in 1903. And I bring them back home I won't tell how the story ends, but I bring them back in 1899. So that still leaves some time unaccounted for. And the only other time you see Sherlock Holmes in the original Conan Doyle stories is you see him briefly in 1907, 1908, that region, and then you see him again in 1914, just before the First World War gets started. And that's it. That's the only hints that are left. So I'm actually, at the present moment, writing an 8th volume, supposedly after the death of Dr. Watson. And what that's going to be is that's going to be something that encases the whole 7 volumes from Holmes's commentary and looks back on the work that Watson has put together through the last years of his life. So it's not part of the 7-volume set, which does reach its own conclusion, but it embraces it. And I got that idea, of course, from Lawrence Durrell, who in his Alexandria Quartet did something similar with his 4th volume.
We're getting short on time here, so I'm going to give you a chance, of course, to say where somebody could obtain these books of yours if they wanted to try to find copies of them.
My book appears, all 7 volumes are available on Amazon.com, and you can read selections from each of the volumes, and they're all connected. and you can read those by looking up where it says "Look inside this book." And you can also order this size, and this is what they look like. You can order this size of the book, and you can get that from kitsappublishing.com. I should explain a little bit about my cover. I'm very pleased with it. It has the twin dragons, which is the opposition of Holmes and Moriarty, and it has these dark forces moving in on the figure of Sherlock Holmes. And I also have an alternate cover design that just has the silhouette of Sherlock Holmes on a kind of a purple background. So those are the two modes in which it's available. I don't know if we have any more time on the concept of writing and what authors are looking for, but every writer writes out of a sense of passion. People that don't write a great deal don't know how much is involved in writing something like this. This took about 7 years of my life, and that's. But it was not ill spent, because I lived inside the book. It was as though it was real, and the people that have read it have pleased me greatly by saying that that's how they experienced it, that it is a real happening, and that sense of involvement is what writers are always looking for.
Well, good. Thank you, Tom, for coming over to the studio for this recording session and everything.
Thank you, Mark.
And I think your creative abilities will be an inspiration to everybody here and to their listening audience. I would like to thank all of our viewers for tuning into the Bremerton Kitsap Access Television and viewing this Kitsap Literary Artists and Writers production. I also wish to thank the BCAT staff on cameras and in the director's chair. Our next broadcast is scheduled for March, when another of the fascinating artists of Kitsap County will grace your TV screen. So keep in touch with your Facebook pages to see what Kitsap author we'll be interviewing. I hope everyone had a pleasant day and a productive and fascinating new year. Until next time, I am Mark Miller with Kitsap Literary Artists and Writers in conjunction with Bremerton Kitsap Access Television. Good day.